This is your PowerPoint lecture on the Progressive Age and its ideological revolution in the way people thought about a whole variety of issues, from philosophy to education to legal theory to even the interpretation of history. So before we begin, there are a few general philosophical categories that I want to give to you that are important to understand how ideas work. When people talk about ideas, they talk about three major things. One thing that they talk about is something called ontology, or the nature of being. What this means is this. The questions are humans self-interested? Are humans good, or are humans basically bad? Another category that we think of is something called epistemology, which is the question about the method of how we gather and find or produce knowledge. And in fact, that last part is really important. You notice that I have here find/produce. That's because that's a question of epistemology itself. Do we discover information, or do we produce and create information? So think about some of the methods that we use to do this. We have, for example, the scientific method. We use philosophy sometimes to develop rational hypotheticals to get us to particular conclusions. For religious people go to revelations. So they go to things like sacred texts, or sacred leaders, or saints, or prophets. Each one of these methods has its advantages and its disadvantages. What's important to remember is that we don't all get knowledge in the same way. The last major category we have is something called teleology, or the purpose or significance of truth. So this is the question about why do we even seek out this notion of truth, and is there even such a thing as truth? That's a question even in and of itself. I know it seems like that might be a strange question to ask. You might even think that that's kind of a radical question to ask, but it's actually really important. Is there even such a thing as truth? Or is this just something that we're kind of rushing off after in order to get, or what do we even define as its being? So when we look at philosophical issues, we have to look at these three areas. Now you might be wondering, okay, wait a minute. We're talking here about history, not philosophy. So why do we need to look at these three areas? Well, the reason why is because when we look at history, we're looking at human beings and human beings' behaviors. And we don't just do history, we actually have to interpret and try to explain how history works. That means inevitably we are going to come up against philosophy. And if we're talking about philosophy, then at that point we have to talk about these three issues. And when you come up with a conclusion about one of these issues, it will tend to box you in. Take, for example, really quick, if you think human beings are basically good. If human beings are basically good, if you really believe that, then at that point you are boxed into certain conclusions. For example, how can you say that human beings do crime? We all know that they do. But if human beings are basically good, then we have to explain why they do crime. And the only explanation that we can come up with is something in society is causing it to happen. It's not the individual who's responsible for it. Now, on the opposite hand, if you say human beings are basically bad, well, okay, that might be a conclusion that solves your problem of crime. But then you would have to answer this question. If human beings are basically bad, then why have human beings done some really good things? And if you really believe that human beings are basically bad, how can you believe in democracy? I mean, if human beings are bad, why would you want to give humans any power? So the point is this. Once you accept an assumption about ontology, epistemology, or teleology, you are in essence boxing yourself in. That's why these things are so important to understand. The Founding Fathers. So the Founding Fathers generally had an approach to philosophy and to how they set up the Constitution. Generally speaking, their approach was an investigation into both the rational and empirical notions of human nature. Now you might be thinking, well, wait a second. I thought you said in the last slide that rational philosophy is different from looking at things that are factual or empirical. Well, the Founding Fathers believed they were doing both. They believed they were using philosophy and science, but in order to discover what is common about all human beings, human nature. And they were referring at that time period to the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment at the time was actually being mixed together with certain religious traditions, and the Founding Fathers believed that they had come to some universal conclusions about who we were as human beings. They argued that really when it comes down to it, all human beings are not so much good, nor are we bad, we are self-interested. And so because of that, if you are somebody who's self-interested, you eventually seek out power. In other words, you seek for a way to fulfill your self-interest. And the best way to do that is to join up with groups of people who seek out common interests. So the main interest of the Founding Fathers was to find a way to stop people from centralizing this power in these groups. And the way they did it was to divide up the power to make sure that no one faction could ever centralize it. In fact, they did this through a very important set of documents that justified the Constitution. They were called the Federalist Papers. And probably the most important of the Federalist Papers is Federalist Paper number 10. Federalist Paper number 10 says it's very important that the country has numerous factions that compete amongst each other and neutralize each other so that no one faction can ever gain too much control. So about 100 years later, we come across the progressive context. And in the progressive context, the people of that time period, so this is late 1800s, early 1900s, they started to look back at the Founding Fathers and they sort of criticized them in a way. Now, don't get me wrong, the progressives didn't say that we ought to jettison or get rid of the Founding Fathers altogether. They very much looked at the Founding Fathers and saw a wisdom that was there, but they made the argument that the Founding Fathers really operated in a context. And the context was different from the context of the progressives. The context was one of agriculture, mercantilism, and mercantile wars. We talked about this in a previous unit when it came to economics. And so the progressives argued that, the United States was no longer this kind of a country. Now, in the 20th century, progressives noticed that the United States was operating in an industrial economy, that there were these growing nation states, and that we were really competing now in international markets. So while most of the country still was agricultural, probably about 80% of people were agricultural, there was a huge, massive demographic shift to urban centers, and it didn't look like this was going to stop. And in fact, we kind of know in the 20th century it didn't. If anything, people didn't just move into urban centers, they began to move into suburban centers. The point being that we no longer lived in the world that the Founding Fathers created the Constitution for. So in order to understand why this matters, we have to go back to a few philosophical schools. One is called the school of Empiricism. Now, Empiricism didn't arise with the progressives. It arose back during the time period of the Enlightenment. And the idea of Empiricism was that the only way that we could really gain knowledge was to gain knowledge that we could measure. I mean, if you want to believe in a religion, that's fine. If you have faith in certain ideas or faith in a God figure or so forth, that's fine, and maybe it's true. But we can't know that it's true, according to Empiricism. The only things that we can know that are true are factual things or concrete evidence that we can weigh. And this means we have to have a focus on objects. And we have that focus by using things like statistics and measurement tools that allow us to weigh empirical evidence. Another thing that the progressives are really going to come across is something called historicism. For progressives, historicism means this. Progressives argue that human beings are thinking objects operating in historical time periods. This means that one historical time period is not the same as another. They are different from each other. And so because of this, they assume that human beings are influenced by the context of a particular time period. Remember, we talked about this in the previous slide. The Founding Fathers were influenced by a context of the Enlightenment, agriculture, and mercantilism. The progressives are influenced by a time period of industrialism, nation states, and the rise of professional science. This is why, for example, you probably have heard the cliche that we study history in order to solve the problems of the past or make sure we don't repeat those problems. Actually, historicism would say that that's just a false cliche. I mean, if that was really true, then you would think historians would be called up all the time to solve problems, but we aren't. And there's a reason why we aren't. The problems of the past existed in a different time period, and they're not so easily compared to the time period of today or any time period. We need to make sure that we look at time periods differently and see how they affected the ideas of that time period. So, according to this argument, the ideas of the Founding Fathers were relevant to an agricultural economy, not an industrial one. Pragmatism. So probably one of the only unique American philosophies is called pragmatism. This starts off in America and then goes out to other parts of the world. And it was developed by two men, one named William James and the other Charles Peirce. They developed this idea, and the idea behind pragmatism is this. Philosophy works best when you can test it against the reality of history. Now, notice there are two philosophies that they're joining together here. They're joining together empiricism and historicism. And the way you can kind of join them together, according to William James and Charles Peirce, is the question of whether or not they work. Now, you might be saying, well, work, what does work mean? I mean, that seems like a very either abstract type of thing, or on the other hand, it can be too narrow, right? I mean, if something works, then that's the only time that it's okay. But James and Peirce would argue that, yeah, actually that's true, and we can measure this both qualitatively and quantitatively. Like, I'll give you an example. Like, let's think about the issue of friendship. Okay, not really an historical issue, but it'll demonstrate their point. For a moment here, you can really say, well, we have a lot of different definitions of friendship, a lot of different definitions of friends, right? But I can kind of tell you what's not friendship. For example, if you know that somebody who's a so-called friend is disloyal to you, or betrays you, or steals from you, or lies from you, or let's just say that there's a girl you really like, and this friend intentionally goes out and tries to steal her away from you, you know that's not a friend. Why? Well, you don't have to have an abstract hypothetical here. You know he's not a friend because your friendship isn't working. In other words, you're not really able to form a bond of trust between the two of you. This is James and Peirce's point. Their point is that even on the most abstract issues, we don't determine if they're good for us based upon some kind of abstract questioning or hypothetical questioning. We base it really upon whether or not that issue is meaningful and significant in our lives. Does it work? And that's the point that James and Peirce are making, but about much bigger issues in society. They want to argue that the way we interpret things and do things in society is based upon the context we live in and whether or not we can test it against the reality of that context. So one of the applications of this, it's a really good example, is John Dewey and education. Up until the late 1800s, traditional education was based upon hierarchy of authority and what's called the banking model of education. So here's the idea behind this. The teacher is considered to be the expert of ideas at the head of the classroom. And the purpose of the classroom really is just to memorize tons of information. The more information you can memorize, the more that can be put into somebody's head, sort of like a bank, the better that they are doing. And if you think about it, today we kind of do a lot of that same thing, right? I mean, I'm sure you've been in a lot of classrooms where the teacher stands up in front of the class and just gives you a lot of information. What do we say is the best way we can figure this out at the end of the year? Well, you take some kind of national standardized test, right? Like the AP test. Well, this is traditional education. John Dewey said this is a bad way of learning. Not only is it bad for learning itself, but it's bad for the purpose of learning. In Dewey's educational system, students learn best through practical experiments. John Dewey was arguing that really when it comes down to it, if you think about it, the mind works best when it is practically oriented, when students are getting their hands dirty, learning from some kind of practical solving question. If you're working in groups or if you're working on some kind of practical problem that you have to do in a project. The idea, according to Dewey, is that students will learn best when they test their knowledge through practical problem solving. But he also argued there's a greater purpose for this. The purpose is not just to acquire knowledge. The purpose is not to pass some test at the end of the year. The purpose was for students to have a real purpose in society. I mean, we live in a democratic society. Even if it's a type of democratic society, a republic, it still is a democratic society, and that means students need to be actively engaged. But how do you get students to be actively engaged if you're just telling them that there's an authority figure that gives them information? Don't you want them challenging and asking questions and doing inquiry and research? And if they're doing that, what are they doing it for? Is it just to get into college and have more money? Or is the real purpose here to be agents of democratic action, agents of citizenship, people who want to go out and create a better republic? This new way of looking at philosophy also had effects on the law. Now, you might remember we talked before about the difference between what's called strict construction and loose construction. So strict construction goes all the way back to Thomas Jefferson, and the idea was that the law should be literally interpreted, and then you provide deductions from that. Loose interpretation says that you should interpret according to the circumstances of the time. Progressive era kind of adopted loose construction, but they added a few things onto it. They argued that really when it comes down to it, the law, just like anything else, is not some type of what we call a transcendent item. It is not something that was created by God. It wasn't something that somehow exists outside of human society. The law in the end is a tool for social change. And if laws were created during the time period of the founding fathers when it was an agricultural society, those laws need to be updated. How can we have those laws that were created in a different context make sense in an industrial context? So the justices always have to ask, like what we saw in Pragmatism, is the law working for the context of the times? But this means law can never be truly, strictly constructed. It has to be applied or interpreted. You might say, well, that's not true. We can truly just go ahead and just apply it strictly. And you might even say, like, for example, we can look at the Constitution, see what it says, and apply exactly what it says. Let's assume for a moment that you're right. Let's assume that we could do something like that. The progressives would ask a question. Why would we do something like that? I mean, sure, even if it was possible to look at the Constitution and say, we know it can be strictly interpreted and applied, that's assuming that there's a purpose to do that. And what is that purpose? For the progressives, the purpose of law is to make the society better. And if that's the case, then how can laws of an agricultural republic make an industrial society better? They have to be updated. That's the purpose. That's what makes them work. Even history would be affected by this new type of philosophy. History became a field of conflicting interpretations based upon the context of the time. For example, Charles Beard looked at the Constitution and he challenged the notion that the Constitution was this document of great elites who had come up with great wisdom ideas of how to separate out powers. Instead, he looked at the document and he said, okay, who wrote this document? Remember, we're looking at context here. So who wrote the document? Well, everybody who went to the Constitutional Convention were either industrial, banking, lawyer, merchant, or farming elites. So what was their goal? Like, what were they after by creating the Constitution? Well, according to Charles Beard, they were after a way to create a stable society to provide stable investments. In other words, the Constitution was an economic document, not a document of ideas. Sure, the Constitution includes ideas, no question about it, but the purpose in the context of the time was to create stable economic situation for stable investments for an elite group of people. Another example of this sort of historical interpretation was with the Bible. The Bible is interpreted through something called higher criticism. Biblical scholars look back at the Bible and they said, if you put what the authors were writing about at that time period, first of all, there was no one author, there were multiple authors. And when did they write their documents and how did they do so? And they argued, really when it comes down to it, the purpose of the Bible was to justify the rise of a Jewish nation or kingdom. And they did that by bringing out this so-called history of Jewish people escaping from bondage and slavery, conquering a group of people in Canaan, and establishing a nation in covenant with this new monotheistic God. In other words, according to these biblical scholars, the Bible was in many ways influenced by the rise of a nation-state or kingdom, not just ideas coming from God. So what are the advantages of this philosophical change? Well, just like anything else, we can look to advantages and disadvantages. In this particular case, you could make the argument that this new type of philosophy recognizes that ideas change over time due to changes in circumstances and context. And that means that we're not going to look back at ideas from the past and just make them into what we call transcendent ideas, meaning that they pass for all time periods. This means that humans can be a part of the process of change. And it also saw the potential for progress through this change in ideas. However, there are also going to be some major disadvantages to this change in philosophy. For one thing, this new empirical philosophy equates humans with objects. If you really think about it, in order to see things this way, you really have to make the argument that humans are just objects in history that go through and are influenced or even determined by the context they live in. And this means that this philosophy does not answer a huge question. Where does free consciousness come from? In fact, progressives would argue that we have free consciousness. They don't deny that. But they really can't argue where it comes from. If free consciousness exists, does it come strictly out of an empirical reality? And if that's the case, then why don't other types of objects in society or in nature have free consciousness? For example, a rock comes from biological material reality, but it doesn't have free consciousness. How do we get free consciousness from material reality? Also, it really doesn't answer how some ideas are transcendent. So for example, none of us today would accept that slavery is a good thing, especially racial slavery. But would we say that racial slavery was okay back in the 1850s, but not okay today? Probably not. We'd probably say that racial slavery was always wrong. But if ideas change over time, and if certain ideas work and sometimes and not another, then couldn't we justify racial slavery for a particular context? Well, how do we get out of this paradox, this problem, that we could justify some pretty terrible things from a different context? Plus, there do seem to be certain elements of human nature that just are transcendent or cross over time periods. For example, humans do appear to be self-interested. It doesn't seem to be just contextual. It seems like in every time period, humans are self-interested. So the other big problem or disadvantage with this philosophy is what it did to our view on human beings. Human beings did get transformed into objects, and objects that could be measured. A good example of this is eugenics. Eugenics was a philosophy or a scientific philosophy developed by a couple of different men. Herbert Spencer in Great Britain took Charles Darwin's ideas and applied them to social life, and then that transferred to America, and a man named William Graham Sumner then applied these ideas. The idea was that genetic adaptation and inheritance left certain groups inferior to other groups racially. This usually meant Eastern Europeans, Southern Europeans, Asians, and Africans were seen as racially inferior. And this was not done by like crazy racist people who had no evidence behind them. This was done by people pointing to science and empirical tests that seemed to show that these beliefs worked and were real. Empirical tests were done on human brains of dead people and supposedly showed that there were brains that were larger in certain groups and smaller in others, showing inequalities based upon race. There was even another type of application of this called phrenology, which was developed as a science of studying brain size. Experiments were done to study the amount of information that a person could store in the brain. Now I want you to note something that's very important here. According to eugenics, going back to empiricism, we could categorize human beings as objects and then measure them and figure out which human beings were better than other human beings. Now, I want you to think of the context here. I mean, remember, historicism was all about context. Why is this arising at this time period? Well, it was at this time period when we saw huge increases in new immigration from Eastern and Southern Europe to the United States. Because of that, a huge fear arose that eventually led to what were called the Emergency Quotas Act that was passed in 1921. It controlled Southern and Eastern Europeans by basing immigration and quotas of immigration off of the late 1800s, so about 1873, right before Eastern and Southern Europeans came. Also remember that this was the time period when African Americans were emigrating to the north through the Great Migration. There was a huge increase in the number of African Americans migrating up to Harlem and other cities, which provided more labor opportunities. So notice that at this time period, progressives are starting to make this argument for looking at human beings empirically, and we have the eugenics movement. It was coming at a time when more and more people of differing ethnic backgrounds were coming into these urban centers. And this led to very specific policies of population control. Now, we never saw in America the consequence of gas chambers or genocide, although Adolf Hitler oftentimes pointed to the fact that he was simply taking American and British ideas and bringing them to their conclusion. The best example, though, in America is a woman named Margaret Sanger. Sanger developed what we now know today as Planned Parenthood. Now, Planned Parenthood today is a very controversial group in society, but Planned Parenthood generally passes out contraception and is also involved in the issue of abortion, really to try and help women to deal with planning out their family size. But originally, when Planned Parenthood was established, it was established to try and control population sizes, especially issues of Southern Europeans, Eastern Europeans, and African Americans in urban centers. And it led to probably one of the most important court cases of this time period called Buck v. Bell. So there was another man who had coined the term eugenics. His name was Francis Galton. And after he had done this, and once eugenics came to America, there was a law passed in Virginia compelling the sterilization of the so-called intellectually unfit. And the best case example of this was a woman named Carrie Buck. Carrie Buck was a woman of special needs and problems mentally in being able to organize information. Today, probably we get a lot of services, but back then the services just were not there and people had a hard time categorizing this. And so under eugenics, she was categorized as unfit. At the time, she had gotten pregnant, and the court claimed that she'd gotten pregnant because of her lack of intellectual capabilities that led to her so-called immoral behavior. Later, it turned out that actually she had been raped by her adoptive brother. The point being this: eugenics and this belief that we could adopt this notion of categorizing and measuring human beings as objects led to real consequences in which human beings were seen as objects who could be manipulated through science. So the significance that we can end off with then about the Founding Fathers and the progressive movement are the following. The Founding Fathers' ideas are not really irrelevant, but according to progressives, they need to be interpreted and updated. Human nature for the Founding Fathers is seen as essentialist. In other words, it's something that goes on throughout all time periods, whereas for progressives, it's relative. Each one of the time periods has its own impact upon human nature, and each one of the time periods has to be seen relative to these ideas. This means that for progressives, the primary problem is not that the government needs a division of powers. Rather, the government should be seen as a tool to supplement other reform movements.